what we're going to do is we're going to start with just kind of macro. What are we seeing in terms of the world of Gen AI, and how is that impacting jobs and skills? Then what we'll talk about are effectively what are some of the innovations and things of how we're seeing institutions respond to those implications. And then finally, we'll talk about just a lot of learnings that we've seen in terms of experimentation over the last 6 months. And then we'll hand it over to our colleagues to talk about what are implications of what we just shared for specific institutions. And we'll try to do that all in 40 minutes. And so we'll give you the Cliff Notes version. Warning, we've got very dense slides, so everybody, pay attention, get your binoculars on. We've got a lot of great data to share. We can probably share the slides, but we will find a way. And most of what I'm sharing, and I believe most of what Lina and team will be sharing, they're shareable reports, so we'll make sure to highlight where you can get that. So let me start with the big macro. What we did about now a year ago was we refreshed a bunch of analysis that we had done on the labor market. And the reason why we did that was we realized that there was a whole lot of change coming from the pandemic, a whole lot of change coming from things like generative AI, and that confluence of factors was creating all kinds of implications of what jobs were growing in demand, what jobs were changing. And so we studied what had happened since the pandemic, what was expected to happen as we looked forward, and then what were the implications for stakeholders like y'all. And to just give you a few punchlines, what we saw when we studied the pandemic was a completely different labor market that we were used to, where we saw almost 2x the number of job openings as unemployed people. The second thing, and I'll spend more time on this in a second, we saw 9 million approximately occupational shifts from 2019. And I'll get into that more, but that stat is actually one of my most optimistic findings from our research. Then as we look ahead, and we'll spend a lot of time on this, our research highlighted that across different scenarios, in our midpoint scenario, we saw that about 30% of activities could be automated across occupations. If we were able to actually adopt and build that into our occupations, that could result in a huge amount of productivity improvements. But this would come with a huge implication of change, where if these things were to happen, we would really need to think about how to support individuals transition from certain occupations, and importantly, really focus on disadvantaged populations and how to help people from low-wage occupations, how to help people of color, how to help women who are disproportionately impacted by some of the things that I'm going to talk about with Wan-Lae. So and I already foreshadowed this, one of the most optimistic findings of our research was that over the last 3 years, for the first time ever, we saw real evidence of people being able to make occupational shifts and occupational transitions. And many of these occupational shifts were actually to jobs of higher wages and jobs that workers were actually indicating that they had a higher preference for. And so, as we talk about a lot of disruption in the labor market, one of the big challenges is how are we going to help people who are in jobs that are declining move to the jobs that are actually growing in demand. And for the first time ever, we actually have real empirical evidence that it can happen. That's the sort of optimistic side of it. The pessimistic side of it is as we look forward, and I'll get into this in a second, the amount of transitions that we're going to need to support are going to only continue increasing. And so we need to build on this optimism and really figure out how can we support this more at scale. What we spent a bunch of time studying from the pandemic and as we looked ahead was not only generative AI, which of course everyone loves to talk about. And so what we spent time on was what else, as we look to 2030, is impacting the labor market. And we saw everything that you'd expect to see in terms of increased healthcare, shifting consumer preferences, AI, of course, but that was just one set of things. There's also going to be huge shifts to the size of the workforce. And so as we think about job transitions and things like that, we also need to think about retirements and immigration and labor force participation. And one of the interesting things that we saw is also over the course of the pandemic, the way that individuals actually preferred work changed quite a bit. And so as we start thinking about the future of work and the skills that are needed, we need to think about new working models. We need to think about non-traditional work. We need to think about how to do things that align with the values and purpose of a new generation of workers that at least seem to be quite different than previous generations. And so we aggregated that all up. And what this slide does, this is just one scenario that we modeled. It's the midpoint scenario, which is why we're focused on it. But what this shows is what is by sector when we look at what the feasibility of automation could be. What we literally did was we looked at every single occupation. We broke down every occupation by the activities that underlie each occupation. Then for every one of those activities, we looked at, can those activities be performed by technology? And at what kind of capability can they be performed by technology versus humans? And then aggregated that up into very different scenarios in terms of how much jobs could be automated. And on the bottom, what you'll see is in aggregate across the economy, what we see is that about 30% of activities could be automated by 2030. And a few punchlines that I want you all to take away was even before Gen AI, our estimates were highlighting about 20% of activities could be automated. Gen AI took that number from about 21% to 29%, which is the 8 that you see at the very bottom of the page. The second punchline that I want you all to take from this slide is that this is going to impact almost every job and occupation. The third punchline is, at least in the vast majority of the scenarios that we've studied, we actually think that this is going to be a story much more about job augmentation than job replacement. And we think all too often people are overly worried about the job replacement part. That's definitely something to pay attention to and something that's going to be important for certain sectors and occupations. But in aggregate, we think that this actually can really be used as a way to improve productivity and help people who are really overworked. My favorite example in a room like this is to talk about teachers. If we think about teachers are some of our most overworked workers in our economy. We've done research and what we've highlighted, not only in the US, but globally, teachers work on average 50 to 60 hours a week. When we looked at what they're spending time on, they're spending a bunch of time on things that are related to bureaucracy, administrative tasks, and things that are not directly impacting student outcomes. And so the entire notion or the optimistic message that you can take from this slide is, how can you help that overworked teacher be able to save 20 to 30% of their time to more directly focus on student outcomes? And can we do that not only for teachers, but also various parts of our economy? And so that's a big takeaway that we would like to articulate. And then the last kind of big message that we'd want to highlight is when you see a slide like this, it's very easy to confuse two different concepts. One is the technical feasibility of automation, and the second is the adoption of automation. And so we all know that there's a huge difference between tech being able to do something and then actually getting people to change and processes to change to implement those things. And so the last thing that I would articulate is actually when we look at the technical feasibility of automation, it's a much higher number than the 30% that you see here. But the reason why you get to the 30% is because of all the factors on the right-hand side of the slide, where there's still some cost implications. There's all kinds of labor market dynamics. But the most important thing is the last one, which is there's a huge barrier of just regulatory and social acceptance before we're going to see some of these changes actually occur at much greater scale. So with that all in mind, what does that actually mean for jobs, skills, and wages? And let me hand it over to Wan-Lae to talk about that.
Great, thank you. Let me make sure I can Perfect. So if you take sort of an occupational view of everything that Saurabh said, what you'll see, and he highlighted this before, is 12 million occupational transitions will be required by 2030. Again, assuming sort of a midpoint adoption scenario. If you look at the way that this chart is broken down, the 4 top sort of categories are the ones where the most volume of those transitions are coming from. These were also hit hardest during the pandemic, meaning that the acceleration of some of that automation actually really was catalyzed by the pandemic. We had several clients during that time, I remember saying, we had a digital transformation plan, we had sort of an automation plan, a strategy. We thought it was going to take 3 to 5 years. We've done that now. And so the question is, how do we think about these additional transitions that are going to occur and to do it in a positive fashion? If you look at some of those kind of dark blue bars, those are the set of occupations that were sort of stalled during the pandemic from a transition perspective, but are now beginning to sort of pick up in a post-pandemic phase. If you take a different view to these occupations and take it from a demographic lens, what you also see is a set of individuals that are going to be disproportionately impacted and sort of that you think about as points of focus. So workers in lower wage jobs are going to be more impacted than higher wage workers. Women are 1.5x more likely to be affected by men. Workers in jobs that require less education, and then individuals of color. Obviously, these are not mutually exclusive, and there's a lot of sort of overlap amongst them. But again, as we think about, and a lot of the organizations in this room think about kind of strategies for how do we help individuals that are going to be impacted, thinking about some of those demographic groups will be really important. This also just places, I think, an ever-heightened emphasis on the skills we've always known are going to be the long-lasting, lifelong skills that can't be necessarily replaced as easily by technology, right? So some of the higher-order skills, we call them sort of adaptability, socio-emotional skills, the critical thinking, the creativity. I think those have all come more to the fore of the public conversation as well as we think about the things that are really valued as we look at the next generation of technologies. And therefore, as we think and talk to stakeholders such as those in this room of what are the things that we can do to prepare for this future of work, and these 6 actions on this page are things that are constantly the ones that I think we have been working with clients on. And there's almost 2 lenses to take this. One is what's the role of generative AI and technology to actually enable some of these things to happen? And then what's the reaction that we should also be taking given the impact of Gen AI on some of these areas? So the first row is a lot around how do you expand talent pools? Hiring for skills. I think the skills-based hiring sort of effort, you've seen different data on how successful has it been. Yes, it's been successful in terms of taking away degree requirements in certain job descriptions. Has it actually changed the way that companies at scale are hiring? Can Gen AI actually help with that with a different way of assessing and helping kind of bring skills and experience to bear in a way that isn't as cumbersome as we think about how those hiring processes are happening? Engaging and supporting women, removing kind of the typical barriers that are keeping women from participating in the labor force, and similarly on historically overlooked populations. Things like expanding broadband access. How do you think about kind of older workers in a different way? The second row is really around how are we investing in developing skills and investing in kind of preparing for the future of work. There's obviously the pipeline build in terms of K-12, in terms of apprenticeships. How are we thinking about that differently and sort of targeting the skill efforts in that area? And then how do we think about reskilling and upskilling at scale? An example I love to use because I think it really brings it home is one of our clients, large financial services company, basically said, look, I can automate and eliminate most of my back office functions tomorrow with technology. I'm not going to do that because I haven't figured out how to reskill and upskill those individuals, and most of those individuals are my Black employee base. So I have to think about that tension, and I want to do this in the right way, so help me think about how to reskill and upskill. That's an example I think like a lot of the people at the next few days could help with, and I think it's also a really inspiring way to think about it. The final thing is just how do we think about different working models and different ways of kind of expanding the option set for individuals that will be most impacted. The final couple slides, we'll maybe just do that, and then we'll take a pause and transition over, is just how are we thinking about kind of the big Gen AI trends that are impacting education and workforce institutions? And we've broken this down into a few categories. One where there's warranted hype and anxiety, because I think there is a lot of buzz that may be unwarranted. A second category around, we're still not quite sure yet, right? And there's still experimentation to be done. There's still proof to be had. And then finally, this isn't just about technology. This is a people challenge as well, and a change management challenge. Anything you would add to that, Saurabh?
No, I think you said it well, where I think as we think about the broader ecosystem, we need this across all institutions. And so when we're highlighting some of these lessons, we've been talking to K-12 school systems, we've been talking to universities, we've been talking to employers, and this is happening in real time, right? And so I think the first thing that we're seeing is there's so much excitement, and you can see it in the conference, but there's the equal version of all that anxiety. And as Wan-Lae shared, like, where is that anxiety coming from? Well, there's still a bunch of open questions. And then where does that manifest? That manifests in the fact that this is going to be a lot more of that people challenge versus the tech challenge. And that relates back to that point that I was trying to make earlier, where there's a fundamental big difference between tech feasibility and tech adoption. And I think the conversation that we need to be having a lot more of is on the adoption side at this point.
Perfect. Well, and that conversation about adoption, I think, is where we, is there one more? Where we pick up. So maybe just to start, to frame our conversation today, did you want to say a few things actually?
Go ahead.
Okay, to frame the conversation today, I think, from the BCG perspective, we've been thinking a lot about what are our clients starting to do already to start to kind of bridge that gap between potential and achieving the value, and how that directly relates to skilling. So what I have here on the page is 3 ways that we see our clients today beginning to kind of approach the question of generative AI and AI specifically. The first is deploy. And this is the question of how do I get some general productivity uplift across my organization from tools that anyone can have access to? So think about ChatGPT, think about Microsoft Copilot. Obviously, that's fairly limited to white-collar jobs, but it's a pretty standard set of tools that can be available. So that's question number 1. Question number 2 is around reshaping critical functions. And that question is really about how do I get significantly, meaning 30 to 40% or more, productivity and value improvement in specific functions. And that's going to vary by your industry, right? Where are the most important value pools? So for many, that's marketing, customer service. And so you can see that play out, for example, in a higher ed context. But that's kind of question number 2. Question 3 is around inventing new business models. And where we see our clients starting to spend a lot of time thinking about it are, what are the new revenue streams that I could pursue? How does the data that I have today enable me to unlock kind of new value? If you're a publisher, thinking about the set of content that you might have that might be valuable to a foundation model or hyperscaler. If you are in a higher ed institution, thinking about what's the new set of programs that are AI focused, or even how do I dramatically change my student experience to have a new offering? So these are kind of the 3 topics, and I would say often working in parallel, and in particular, I would say many starting the deploy topic as a way to experiment and learn and to figure out what is it going to take to drive the adoption in their organizations of broader topics. And just to this comment, right, it's very hard to actually get the real value. So far, what we've seen is adoption overall being quite low, right? Low single digits, as you see on the page. And also very few organizations really even implementing any sort of training. And ultimately, what you're seeing is a lot of disappointment at the moment. About 2/3 of executives feeling like they have not yet achieved the real promise of AI. And this goes ultimately to a mismatch, I would say, in the efforts in an organization. Often we show up and our clients have focused extensively on selection of the right technology vendors or cleaning of the data and spent almost no time thinking about the adoption cycle, the processes that need to be evolved, how talent and skills need to be shifted to match the new work. And the 10-20-70 rule is that the effort, 70% of the effort and 70% of the value really lies in the process and people change. The exciting thing about generative AI, from my view, is that many of the tools actually have such good interface and such good intuitiveness that it actually eases some of the process changes and some of the complexity you might have experienced previously, but it's still really important. And so with that, I'd say we're spending a lot of time with our clients on 2 questions. There are many others, but I would say these are 2 of the things that we're saying come up often from an imperatives perspective. One is just really anchoring on the value. To the comment made earlier, right, generative AI is not free. Money does not fall from trees. And so if you're really aiming to get to rolling out things within an organization, you have to have a strong value proof and value case. And often that looks like taking some of the broad market applicability and figuring out what does that mean for your organization specifically. So identifying the use cases with the highest value potential. It also means really being willing to challenge current notions of work. So the idea of reshape, right? That doesn't mean just like inserting AI or generative AI into the processes we've done before. It actually means reimagining and reshaping kind of that function almost from scratch, with AI or generative AI being a contributor, but not the only one. And so that's number 1. And number 2 is really this kind of laser focus on people, and especially around upskilling and how that's designed to really make sure that you've focused on new skills and talent for AI and generative AI. And with that,
all right, so probably by this time, everybody is realizing that there's a supply and demand imbalance in the market, right? It's been one of the things we've been talking about, and so one of the reasons what we'll share with you today is how some of those companies are using upskilling and reskilling to help address that in the context of their organization and unlocking that value. So, one of the things we've been talking a lot about is value. And one of the ways that we have been starting to talk about it is ROLI, return on learning investment. And with all good learning, this really starts with the outcome in mind. It starts with what's the value that the organization is trying to unlock? How do we think about customizing an upskilling solution or reskilling training to unlock that within the context of the value pool? So there's 4 key aspects that we're seeing a lot of organizations starting to focus on. First one is really, is it relevant? So, in the flow of work, we know that adult learners particularly want to make sure that the foundational aspects are important, but it needs to be relevant to their actual job and what they're going to be doing in the future. So how do you make sure that it's really integrated and relevant into their day-to-day work? The second part is scale. For a lot of these organizations, multinational organizations, tens of thousands of employees from the top executive team all the way down to the rock face of deskless workers, how do you make sure you have the right sort of scale and the right sort of personalization within the context of the organization for how those workers' jobs are going to change? So, kind of in learning, we often talk about personalization, and kind of in the context of upskilling and reskilling, that's oftentimes kind of where in the organization are you? What's your day-to-day job? How does the advent or how do the new tools that organizations are rolling out from a Gen AI perspective impact the marketing department versus the procurement department versus the frontline workers? And so really having some, kind of aspect around that personalization into the job is really important. And then it's really about embedding it into the organization. One of the other themes I think we've all been talking about here is that this is not like a one and done. You're not just going to upskill once and then walk away. So it really becomes an ongoing, kind of efforts from the organization that needs to be embedded into it, and how the organization needs to really reimagine its upskilling efforts across the organization. So these are the 4 areas that we oftentimes focus on in terms of like what we're trying to deliver from an upskilling perspective, particularly when we're talking about Gen AI, which is where a lot of these conversations are happening today. So let's talk a little bit about the who. And kind of one of the things that we're noticing from the organizations is that there's really 4 key areas or cohorts of learners where the upskilling needs to occur. So the first one are those that are leading AI. These are oftentimes your executive team, your top 50, 100 executives. They need to have the foundational knowledge of understanding how these models work, what's the opportunity, where should they be pointing their efforts, what are the early value pools that they should be looking at to unlock, and what are those early proof of concepts they want to do. That's oftentimes very different depending upon if you're a technology company versus a manufacturing company. Where are you on that kind of like range of maturity from having your data in place, having the technology in place, understanding how those algorithms work, rolling out the Gen AI. The second level down is really those roles that shape and govern AI. And so these are oftentimes your functional leaders. And these are the leaders who are often tasked with operationalizing it within a given department. So what is the impact for a digital marketing team, and what are the tools and the tool sets that team needs to use as they think about new agents, new technology, new ways of working, and unlocking some of these efficiency gains that we've been talking about. The third area that happens is really those building AI, right? Those who are the technologists, and this is a lot of the technical training. One of the things we were talking about at break coming in is things are changing so quickly that even kind of new upskilling that is 3 months old could be vastly outdated. Then you take on top of that all of the different models and the different use cases. It's really easy for a lot of the technology teams, those who are building it and trying to use it, to get behind. And so how do you make sure that you have that constant upskilling for those teams as well? And then the last one, and this is the one that's really hard, is kind of at that rock face. It's your frontline, it's your deskless worker. And you're talking about a lot of scale here, but also a lot of opportunity to kind of fundamentally change the way that work gets done. So as you think about rolling out to hundreds of thousands of employees who might just have access to a mobile phone, who don't have kind of a lot of extra time to take, how do you build it into a way that enables them to do their work more efficiently, more effectively, and allows them to upskill and maintain relevancy in their job? So these are the 4 areas that we oftentimes talk about in terms of distinct user groups that need to be upskilled along the way. And then let's talk about how. So, again, there's the foundational knowledge, regardless of which of those 4 areas you're talking about, there's some sort of foundational knowledge you need. That foundational knowledge can change quickly. So how do you make sure that you're giving the right sort of common lexicon, the right sort of language, and the right sort of tool set and foundational knowledge so that all of the workers can continue to kind of roll it out? And then it's really the application and making it relevant in the day-to-day, right? The foundational knowledge isn't going to matter if you don't make it immediately relevant to their job. And then embedding it, and that's where the continuous kind of feedback circles need to come. And so, a lot of times when we see working with organizations is that they're really thinking about all of the different tool sets that they have from a learning and development and online learning and a teaching and coaching perspective, and they need to think about how do you bring that together into a customized upskilling that meets the needs of all of the different functions in your organization, and then embeds it into the workflow. And so, things like master classes, performance reviews, nudges, one-on-one coaching, knowledge checks, performance assessments, all of these things are kind of coming to bear to think about what does that upskilling solution need to look like in order to unlock that value and then continue to progress. So with that, we're going to take you through 3 different use cases where we're seeing this from some of our clients today and talk about how they're starting to unlock value. And one of the things you'll notice, if we go back to the Rolly example, is that it's really hard sometimes, especially early, to quantify what the return on that learning investment is. And so here are 3 use cases, and then we can go from there. So the first one, roles that lead. So recently BCGU partnered with Google Cloud to upskill their Fortune 1000 executive leaders. And the problem was that there's a lot of uptick from the implementation of Google Cloud, but a lot of their clients didn't really know how to unlock the value from it from a use case perspective. And so we went through and developed 2 different upskilling sessions, one a 2-hour virtual one and a 5-hour in-person one. We delivered over 140 different workshops to targeted accounts. And through that, there's 3 different things that we delivered. One was that foundational knowledge, right? The second thing was the application. What is the application of of the Google Cloud capabilities into your own existing organization and industry? And then third, what are some pilot use cases? Where do you start, right? That was one of the things that a lot of executives are struggling with is there's so much opportunity. Where do I start? So with that, we've developed over 1,000 use cases. The NPS scores for these were over 50. And yet, only 1 in 3 said that it moved their Gen IA agenda forward, right? So there's still tremendous opportunity out there. Even with this investment, even with kind of thinking through it, how do you continue to unlock that? The next one is around a global financial services organization. And so this is really around how you enable the next layer down, the next 1,000 leaders to become more digitally minded and able to develop and lead a Gen AI team. And so from this, this organization was looking to basically develop a digital leader curriculum. And they wanted to have a common lexicon. They wanted to be able to deliver it. And it really started with how do we take advantage of all the Gen AI out there. And as we got into developing the upskilling with them, what we actually realized is that yes, Gen AI was a really important part of it, but it was also product mindset. It was also understanding data. It was also leading without authority. It was product management. It was all sorts of things that went into actually needing to manage through the change management of implementing Gen AI. So it's a really good example of, yes, we talk about Gen AI, we talk about, kind of how do you unlock the value here, but it's not as simple just like implement a new agent into a new workflow. There's a lot that goes into the change management associated with it. We've gotten through the first wave. We've had 250 executives go through it. We had an amazing over 80 NPS score, which I've never seen in education before. But most importantly, the leaders coming through it felt much more confident about being able to lead their teams and having that common lexicon and that understanding of where the organization was going and how to unlock value consistently and work across the organization. The last use case is not a Gen AI use case, but we're going to share it today because I do think it's a pretty interesting opportunity to talk about the rock face, where kind of frontline deskless workers are actually the ones who are most impacted. And so for this, we worked with a global auto manufacturer who had the moonshot of wanting to become the largest EV sales car company in the world. And one of the challenges that they realized was that their sales force, 170,000 car salesmen, 3,000 locations, did not feel comfortable in making the transition from selling combustion engines to electric vehicles. And so how do you upskill that many people? And what we did is we took 20 hours of content, we reduced it to 45 minutes, we made it mobile first. We scanned the web and identified the top 20 objections through social media of kind of EV sales, and we basically built that into a mobile-first delivery where the sales team could finish it on their lunch break. Just taking 20 hours down to 45 minutes, we still had 90% content mastery coming out of it, which is a great example of how kind of putting it into the workers so that coming out of the lunch break, you could immediately apply that on the sales room floor. It's how you make it relative, how you make it real time, and how you make sure that you're able to embed it into it. So these are 3 areas where we're seeing some of our clients starting to address the supply and demand imbalance through upskilling their own workforce and thinking about how do you take that existing labor market who's already part of your organization, who knows your culture, who knows your ways of working, and make them that much more, more effective and more efficient. Lina, would you like to take us home?
Yeah, I will. And I think as I do this, I want to actually come back, Saurabh and Wan-Lae, to where you started. There is a massive amount of change coming, and there's also risk that we leave behind pretty significant populations that are going to see their jobs and their livelihoods disrupted. And I think in particular about our frontline worker, our deskless worker population that is disproportionately women and is disproportionately people of color. And so as we think about identifying value pools, setting a vision grounded in business value, upskilling early and often, I want to leave you with 3 calls to action as leaders, even as you think about all this incredible upside and potential of Gen AI, but also thinking about populations and employees and workers and what you can do to be a better steward of their careers and their pathways. Number 1, think about who you are hiring and think about the people whose jobs might be most disrupted by this technology. Widen labor pools. Think about bringing in people and populations that may have been historically marginalized or left out. Think about Americans with disabilities, the justice-impacted population, or veterans, people from rural America. How can they be brought in and brought to get upskilled, trained, and retained over time? Number 2, think specifically and carefully about what different worker populations are going to need, both from a skilling and upskilling standpoint, but also just from a support standpoint. How can employers, corporations, government agencies work on that as well? And then 3rd, how can we start to fundamentally shape and reshape our talent systems to support the jobs of the future? It starts with hiring, it continues through onboarding, development, and advancement. And I will say there's a lot of corporations that we've seen and researched who are starting to make remarkable strides. I know we're sitting in a room that is sponsored by Walmart, and I will call them out as a leader on a number of these dimensions I just brought up. So I'll also use this maybe as an opportunity for a little plug. We have a piece or a series of publications that just came out on these topics, and we feel pretty passionately about them. But even as we talk about the future and the promise of technology, I also want to bring it back to the people. Think about the people and what you're going to do to keep them engaged, motivated, happy, and able to access incredible promise that we have ahead of us. So with that, 1 minute, 10 seconds. We promised we would save time for questions. So let me open it up to the group.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to start. I mean, from all of the disruptions that we highlighted across scenarios, we actually see the labor market growing in jobs. And where that's coming from is, as much as we're seeing the disruptions, there's going to be net new occupations. And you just articulated a bunch of things that we've seen as we've studied the history of this, where that's been the case as we've moved from agriculture to a service economy. some of the big areas, in particular in the US, where we're seeing that in terms of job growth, relate to things related to infrastructure and climate. That's like a major category. Things that are kind of out there, but that we're hearing a lot of people talk about, is around the space economy. Things that are very much related to tech occupations is the intersection of what we're talking about in terms of Gen AI, but the intersection of that with some of the things that we've commonly not associated with technology, so things around philosophy, ethics, things like that. And so, one of the interesting implications that we're hearing, not even just in the industry conversation, but on the higher ed side, is how do we create this AI fluency, not just for the computer scientists, but we actually see a bunch of job categories that are being created in our law schools, in our liberal arts schools, in our humanities schools. And so our overall punchline that we've seen from the data from studying this is across most scenarios, we actually see the job market growing.
Yeah. Maybe I'll just add, so to the comment about kind of, only focusing, I think, on job reduction, I would just say productivity does not necessarily equal, same with less. Productivity can mean more with same as well, and that's actually how most of my clients have actually interpreted the word productivity and how we've encouraged them to interpret that. So that's comment one. Comment two is that when I think about kind of reinvention, or sorry, not reinvention, invention, so that third category, right? That's actually new business models, new revenue streams. You need people to go run and build and service those new revenue streams, so it's ultimately a major growth engine for many. And then third, to your comment on kind of reshaping and reinventing functions, we actually do see a number of new functions emerging. Chief, you mentioned kind of responsible AI being kind of chief among them as kind of the first, but even, I would say, if I think about some of the corporate functions, there are new roles that my clients are thinking about that don't exist today, but that will need to exist to account for the pace of change.
We're getting the out of time signal, so we can take some questions after.
Happy to talk after. Thank you all.